warm spring morning in the village of Limstock, the tranquility of the countryside was disturbed not by murder or violence, but by the confounding theft of a single painting, one that no outsider would likely deem valuable. The theft took place at Windward House, a stately old manor perched at the end of a narrow, hedged lane. Its owner, Colonel Geoffrey Warburton, a retired officer with a stiff jaw and sharper habits, was found pacing furiously outside his locked study, clutching a brass key and bellowing at the butler that something damned absurd had happened. When the study door was finally opened, there being only one key which the colonel always kept on his person, the scene inside was peculiar. Nothing was out of place. Books sat neatly on their shelves, the desk was untouched, and even the small safe behind the curtain remained locked. Yet above the fireplace, the large space that once held a rather grim-looking portrait of his late wife, Millicent Warburton, was now empty. The painting had vanished entirely. The local constable, young and mildly apologetic, took down statements, while the colonel growled and smoked cigars. The room had no other entrance. The windows were bolted from the inside and nothing else was disturbed. No footprints on the garden soil below the windowsill, no broken locks, no signs of intrusion. "It's like the blasted woman spirited herself off the wall," the colonel snapped. The strange part was not merely the disappearance of the painting. It was who would want it. Millicent Warburton had not been especially admired in life. Even the artist had admitted it wasn't his finest work. She died 10 years ago, and the portrait hadn't moved since. By afternoon, gossip had already spread through Limstock, and naturally the matter reached the ear of Miss Marple. She had come to Windward House not to inspect the scene, but under the pretense of delivering some rose cuttings to Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper. Miss Marple, with her delicate voice and peering blue eyes, quietly collected a string of curious inconsistencies as she sipped tea in the servants' hall. For instance, Mrs. Finch mentioned that the colonel had refused to let the portrait be cleaned for years, claiming it was fine as it was, and that he had been particularly out of sorts the past week, locking himself in the study late into the night and demanding absolute silence. Then there was Cook's offhand remark that someone had knocked over the vase in the corridor 3 nights prior, yet no one had claimed responsibility. The house's daily routine, the locked door, and the single key created the impression of an impossible crime. No one could have entered, and yet the portrait was gone. The colonel's daughter, Cecily, who had returned from London for a short visit, claimed she had last seen the painting the previous morning when she came to announce her engagement. "It was hideous," she told Miss Marple when they met in the garden. "Frankly, it always gave me the creeps, but father insisted it stay, said it was a matter of honour. Now it's gone, and he's furious, of course, though oddly quiet this morning." Miss Marple found this detail notable. The colonel, while furious, had apparently made no effort to call Scotland Yard or place a reward for the portrait's return. Nor had he spoken much to his daughter about it, despite her being the only other person with regular access to the house. The butler, Phelps, confirmed under mild questioning that only the colonel ever entered the study without escort. Even, the cleaning was done under supervision. The puzzle deepened that evening when the gardener's boy found a fragment of canvas wedged beneath a hedge some distance from the house, near the old tool shed. It was charred slightly at the edge and bore a smear of dark paint, enough to raise suspicion that the portrait might have been destroyed. Yet the colonel, when shown the scrap, dismissed it as rubbish and claimed no interest in forensics. "Who steals a dead woman's face?" he barked at the constable as though the very question was beneath him. "There's no scandal here, no money in it. She wasn't even beautiful." But Miss Marple was not so sure. The more she looked at the empty space on the wall, the more she wondered not how the painting had vanished, but why now. The timing seemed oddly precise. Cecily's return, the news of her engagement, the colonel's increasing agitation, and the strange silence around the study at night. She took a quiet walk around the perimeter of the house, stopping to examine the flower beds and the base of the window panes. A faint smear of oil on one sill, a disturbed edge of gravel beneath it, and a single snapped thorn from a climbing rose caught her attention. Not much, but not nothing either. By the end of the day, no arrests had been made, and the constable admitted he was at a loss. Miss Marple, sitting in her small parlour that night with her knitting, considered all that she had learned. A painting, long despised, removed under impossible circumstances. A man who had guarded it obsessively but seemed strangely relieved in some quiet way to see it gone. And a household filled not with suspects, but secrets. It was not the theft itself that concerned her most. It was what the painting might have shown, something that had become inconvenient now, after 10 years of silence, something someone had reason to erase. The next morning brought with it a rare drizzle, soft and persistent, muting the village's usual activity. Miss Marple arrived at Windward House under the cover of an invitation from Cecily Warburton to discuss botanical matters, though the girl's interest in flora had always been politely feigned. Cecily greeted her with evident relief and ushered her straight into the morning room, away from her father's glowering presence. "He's been insufferable since yesterday," she whispered. "Doesn't want anyone touching anything. Says it's all a private matter now and won't even let the constable return. He's locked the study again." Miss Marple sat quietly as Cecily fetched tea, her eyes drifting to the hallway mirror, faintly fogged from the damp. A long wool coat was hung on the stand, a man's, recently brushed and oddly damp at the cuffs. She made no comment, simply stored the detail away. When Cecily returned, flustered but trying for composure, Miss Marple asked gently whether she had ever seen her father disturbed in this way. Cecily hesitated. Only once, when Mother died. And oddly, when someone once sent an anonymous letter about her. I was young, but I remember. He burned it immediately. As the tea cooled between them, Miss Marple asked quite casually whether the painting had ever been moved since Millicent Warburton's death. Cecily blinked. "No, not that I know of. But now that you mention it, last month Father did have Mr. Deering from the frame shop over. Claimed it was to tighten the backing. I thought nothing of it, honestly. Just one of his moods." Miss Marple thanked her and left shortly after, slipping through the back path past the rose beds and toward the village. She called first at the frame shop on the high street. Mr. Deering, a pale man with square spectacles, was reluctant to speak at first, but relaxed when Miss Marple mentioned her interest in preservation techniques. "Yes, the Colonel had me up last month. Odd fellow. Insisted I look at the frame without removing the canvas. Said he didn't want the image exposed. Claimed it was fragile. But between you and me, there was nothing wrong with the frame. He just stared at the backboard for a good long while, then sent me off with a generous tip. Bit peculiar." By now, a clearer picture had begun to sketch itself in Miss Marple's mind, not yet detailed, but sketched in outlines. She made one more stop, at the vicarage, where the young curate had offered his assistance to the investigation the day before. He, too, had been turned away by the Colonel. "Said it was a family matter," he told her ruefully. "But I found something a little strange outside the hedge path, near the garden wall, an old glove, damp, with red paint on the thumb." Miss Marple examined it carefully. The paint was flaked, dried, but unmistakably the sort often used in oil portrait underlayers. She asked him to keep it safe and made her way back to Windward House just as the rain began to fall more heavily. She waited by the gate until the butler appeared at the entrance. With a soft voice and an expression of vague apology, she asked if he might assist her with a question about family portraits in the house, particularly any other paintings of Mrs. Warburton. Phelps was careful with his answers, but not insincere. "None but the one, madam. The Colonel said she hated being painted. That one above the fireplace was done when she was ill. She resented it terribly. And yet he kept it all these years, Miss Marple mused. He did, madam, and yet never looked at it. That remark struck her. Never looked at it. She stepped back, nodding her thanks. And the painting, she asked, how tall would you say it was? Oh, nearly life-size. 4 feet, I believe. Quite heavy. The frame alone took 2 men to mount. Too heavy, Miss Marple thought, for a single person to smuggle out without detection. And if the study door remained locked until the morning of its discovery, the disappearance had either occurred far earlier, or the painting had never left the room at all. She returned that afternoon when the Colonel left for his club, under the pretense of visiting Cecily again. This time she made her way, discreetly, into the study. The fire was cold in the grate, and the wall where the painting had hung now looked oddly cleaner than the rest of the room. Dust patterns remained where the frame had been, but only faint ones. She examined the wall closely. A tiny screwhead sat flush in the plaster, oddly new. And at the edge of the floorboard beneath the hearth, she saw the faint scrape mark of something recently dragged. Kneeling carefully, she ran her fingers along the skirting board and then paused. One plank, just beneath where the painting had hung, was a fraction out of alignment. She pressed gently. It did not move, but the scrape mark suggested someone had used this spot for something, perhaps to hide, or to pry, or to destroy. Her gaze drifted upward again to the fireplace mantel, where a small brass ornament was slightly turned. She stepped over and adjusted it. A soft click followed, and a narrow panel in the wall, previously indistinguishable from the plaster, creaked open. Inside, no painting. Just a flat linen cloth and an empty wooden frame. The portrait, it seemed, had been removed by the Colonel himself and hidden temporarily. But why? And why now? The real deception was beginning to take form. Miss Marple, with her clear blue eyes and mild expression, stepped away from the hidden panel and returned it to its closed position. The Colonel hadn't reported the theft to the authorities because there hadn't been one. Not at first. Whatever had once been hidden behind that painting, either within the frame, the canvas, or the wall itself, was what had prompted its disappearance. Someone had needed to retrieve something, or hide it, and someone else had perhaps discovered it. The red paint on the glove, the disturbed hedge, the quiet reference to an anonymous letter from long ago. It wasn't merely about a missing portrait anymore. It was about what had been inside, or what it had revealed. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, knitting bag in hand, her mind quietly sifting through layers of deception, motive, and memory. The first lie had been told. Now it was only a matter of waiting for the second. Miss Marple returned to Windward House the following morning under no pretense at all. Cecily had sent for her, nervously insistent in her note that things are not as they seem. Miss Marple found her in the breakfast room, fingers wrapped around a teacup, eyes distant. "He confronted me last night," Cecily said without greeting, "said I had no right to pry. I only asked why he refused to speak to the police. He turned pale, Miss Marple. He never goes pale." Miss Marple sat quietly, waiting. Cecily inhaled, shakily, and continued. "He asked whether I'd been in the study, said if I had I should forget what I saw. But I didn't see anything. He assumed too much." Miss Marple asked gently whether she had ever noticed her father hiding anything in the house. "I always assumed he kept secrets, but they weren't mine to know," she said. "He had a way of pretending to be transparent, when in truth you never really knew what he was thinking." After leaving Cecily with reassurances, Miss Marple requested a quiet word with Phelps. The butler met her in the conservatory, visibly tense. "It's not my place to say, madam," he said after some persuasion. "But if you ask me, something's been bothering him for months, since Christmas at least. restless at night, disappearing, for hours to his study and returning smelling faintly of turpentine. I assumed it was memories of the late Mrs. Warburton, but, Miss Marple asked, voice feather-light. Phelps hesitated. There's a drawer in the desk, locked always. 2 nights ago I came into dust and found it open just briefly. There were letters, faded, fragile. He saw me notice and slammed it, shut. Did you recognize the handwriting? Phelps shook his head, though uneasily. No, madam, but I know his hand, and this wasn't his. That afternoon, Miss Marple called upon the local solicitor, Mr. Arnold Biggs, under the pretext of asking after a friend's will. Over tea, she mentioned the colonel in passing. Biggs raised an eyebrow. Strange fellow. Doesn't trust banks, hides his deeds in his own safe. We've drawn up his will a dozen times, yet he changes nothing. Keeps the portrait mentioned. In the document, though, a specific clause about it not being sold or moved from Winwood House. Odd, considering how much he hated it. Hated it? Miss Marple asked, gently surprised. Oh, yes. Told me once it was the price he paid to bury a mistake. I didn't inquire further. Returning to Winwood House just before sunset, Miss Marple found young Constable Rayner outside, the gate, lingering awkwardly. He called us off the case, ma'am, Rayner said apologetically. Said it was a personal matter. Not much we can do unless there's new evidence. There may yet be, Miss Marple said quietly, and went. Inside, she asked to speak with the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, who led her to the side parlour with her apron still dusted in flour. I've worked here 20 years, she said cautiously, and I never thought I'd speak ill of the colonel. But he's not himself lately. He mutters things at night, walks the halls, and I heard something the day the painting disappeared. Raised voices. I couldn't hear much, just the phrase, I did what I had to, and then a door slamming. But he was alone in the house, or so he claimed. Who else was present that day? No one. Except perhaps Miss Cecily briefly. She'd gone out by the time the shouting happened. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, fingers laced in her lap. Do you believe he was alone, Mrs. Finch? The housekeeper hesitated. No, I don't. The back door latch was loose and someone had boiled water in the kitchen kettle, yet I hadn't been in. There was also a second coat in the hallway, not the colonel's. That coat, Miss Marple recalled, the damp one with the brushed sleeves. She'd noted it before. It hadn't been there the following day. Mrs. Finch, she asked, was the late Mrs. Warburton a sociable woman? She had her moods, the housekeeper admitted carefully, but she kept to herself mostly. Didn't care for village life. She had her friends from before, London people. There was one woman in particular years ago, a friend named Mrs. Yvonne Hargrave, used to visit regularly but stopped after the funeral. Rumours swirled, but nothing ever came of them. What sort of rumours? That Mrs. Warburton had been corresponding with someone else. Not proper, I'm afraid, but the colonel put an end to that talk very quickly. Miss Marple thanked her and left. The picture, while still incomplete, was slowly coming together. That evening she sent a note to the vicar requesting any record of visitors to the graveyard in the last fortnight. He replied the next morning, noting only one unfamiliar visitor. A middle-aged woman, smartly dressed, who came late afternoon and stood at the Warburton plot for nearly half an hour. Said nothing to anyone, left in a hired car. Miss Marple's next visit was to the frame shop once more, where Mr. Deering, now slightly less guarded, remembered something more. It was the frame backing, you see, he said, rummaging through old papers. He had me bring it to the shop last week for measurements. Said he was having a new piece cut. I thought nothing of it then, but it was strange. The original backing was unusually thick. Not standard. I offered to replace it, but he refused. Could a document be hidden inside a painting's backing? Oh, certainly we see it from time to time. Old wills, letters, pressed flowers, that sort of thing. Miss Marple's walk home was slow and thoughtful. The contradictions were growing louder. The Colonel claiming the theft had happened that morning, but Mr. Deering having removed the frame a week before. The missing coat. The conversation no one else should have heard. A visitor to the graveyard who vanished just as quickly as she arrived. The fragments did not yet form a complete picture, but they pointed towards something carefully concealed. The painting had held more than oil and canvas. It had hidden something, the past perhaps, or a truth long buried. And now that it was gone, everyone had something to say, or something to hide. A fog crept over Lymstock the next morning, thick enough to blur the hedgerows and dull the outlines of Windward House from the garden path. Miss Marple arrived again, unannounced this time, with the quiet authority of someone no longer merely observing, but assembling. Phelps opened the door with a nod that spoke more of understanding than surprise, and without being asked, led her not to Cecily or the Colonel, but to the drawing-room where she found both already seated, on opposite ends of the room. The air was colder between them than the fog outside. Cecily rose to speak, but her father's sharp voice cut her off. "Miss Marple," the Colonel said without rising, "I assume you've not come to discuss flowers?" "No," she answered, plainly. "I've come because there are things being hidden, and if they remain hidden much longer, someone will suffer unjustly." The Colonel's jaw worked against itself before he replied. "There's no crime here, no theft, no wrongdoing." "Then why so many lies?" she asked softly. "Why did you tell the constable the painting vanished overnight, when Mr. Deering removed the frame a full week earlier? Why hide your study's wall compartment? Why silence your daughter when she simply asked questions?" He didn't reply. Cecily stood frozen, eyes locked on her father. The silence lingered too long, and Miss Marple, not pressing further, turned instead to Cecily. "My dear, who inherits Windward House when your father passes?" "Technically, me," she said slowly, "but only if I remain unmarried within the family's expectations. He always hinted at disowning me otherwise." "Yet you're engaged," Miss Marple said. "To someone he's never approved of," Cecily muttered. "That's why I didn't tell him until I arrived. I thought he might, well, get over it. He didn't." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And your fiancé, he's a Mr. Alan Morley, is he not?" Cecily flinched. "You've heard of him?" Only what Mrs. Finch let slip, an outsider, not of the Colonel's circle. Clever, ambitious, and not afraid to challenge authority. Aniso. Colonel made a derisive sound. "That man's after the house. She doesn't see it. The moment I'm gone, he'll gut the place and sell it off for parts." Cecily stepped forward, defiant now. "He's not like that. You think everyone's playing a game against you. You won't let anyone in, not me, not Mother, no one." The word mother cast a stillness over the room, more absolute than anything before. The Colonel's expression shifted, anger fading not into sorrow, but something more guarded. Miss Marple broke the silence. "Perhaps we should speak plainly about Millicent Warburton, about what that painting really concealed." His eyes flicked to hers, but he said nothing. "You didn't hate the portrait because it reminded you of her. You hated it because it reminded you of a secret she left behind. A secret you've tried very hard to erase." Still no answer. But he didn't interrupt. Miss Marple turned to Cecily. "There's a possibility your mother was involved, in a correspondence your father forbade. A relationship perhaps that went beyond friendship. Letters hidden inside the painting's frame backing. That's what Mr. Deering unknowingly helped remove. Your father retrieved them, but someone else may have known. And they wanted them too." The Colonel gave a bitter laugh. "You think this is about passion? You think Millicent was some tragic heroine? She was clever, manipulative, and ambitious. She used that artist, Sedley, because he gave her what I couldn't. Influence, city friends, gossip. She hid things, yes. But not because she was afraid, because she enjoyed it. But someone else has seen those letters now, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone besides you. Cecily glanced at her father. Was that why you shouted the night before the painting? Vanished. You weren't alone, were you? The Colonel didn't answer. His silence by now was an admission. Miss Marple stood. Forgive me, I must speak to Alan Morley. She found him waiting at the vicarage. Tall, with a clean, earnest face and sharp eyes that missed little. He didn't pretend to be surprised. Cecily warned me you might come, he said calmly. I have nothing to hide, Miss Marple, but I think her father does. She watched him carefully. Do you know what was inside the painting? Letters. Love letters, I presume. I haven't seen them, but I know someone else who might have tried. Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Yvonne Hargrave. I met her briefly when I was in London researching an old estate file. She introduced herself as an old friend of the Warburtons, said she had unfinished business with Geoffrey Warburton and might return to Lymstock. Miss Marple's thoughts turned sharply to the woman in the graveyard, the one no one could identify. Did she say what sort of business? She said Millicent left her something, a confession of sorts, that Geoffrey knew the truth, but buried it. I assumed she meant figuratively. Now I wonder if it was more literal. Later that day, Miss Marple visited the church archives. With the vicar's help, she obtained records of family plot arrangements. She discovered something startling. A burial had been recorded for a stillborn child, unnamed, listed as Baby Warburton, interred quietly 2 years before Millicent's death. No one had ever spoken of it, not even Cecily. Returning to Windward House for the final time that evening, she asked the Colonel one question, softly but firmly. Was the child yours? The Colonel's face collapsed inward. No, he said hoarsely. And Millicent never said whose it was. But I knew. That's why I kept the painting. I thought she'd hidden something. I didn't know it was all there, in the letters. And when someone came to claim them, Miss Marple said, you made them disappear. I told her to leave, he muttered. Told her I'd burn them, but she said she had proof. Miss Marple stepped back. Then the question is, did she take the letters before you hid them or after? Because if she had, the mystery wasn't over. It was only buried, and someone else might already be holding the truth in their hands, watching the Warburton family unravel from a quiet distance. The following morning brought news that spread, faster than the mist rolling off the hills. Mrs. Yvonne Hargrave had been located in Bath, and with her, an envelope containing what she claimed were the original letters hidden behind the missing portrait. The local police, roused by this unexpected development, were quick to act. The letters were collected, catalogued, and examined. At first glance, they appeared damning enough. Passionate, melancholy correspondences from Millicent Warburton to a man only referred to as D, hinting at regret, a broken promise, and a buried truth that she claimed would remain safe behind the canvas, untouched by time or shame. The authorities, keen to wrap up a case that had become more inconvenient than criminal, took this as conclusive. Colonel Warburton was cleared of wrongdoing. There was no theft, merely a private retrieval of family material, and the painting, it was decided, had likely been destroyed to bury the shame once and for all. Yvonne Hargrave, they said, had simply tried to reclaim what she believed was hers. The letters were returned to the Colonel under official supervision. He locked them in his safe without ceremony, and that, it seemed, was the end of it. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Something about the letters, the paper too crisp, the ink oddly unfaded, nagged at her. And more importantly, the timing was all wrong. If Mrs. Hargrave had retrieved them, then why had the painting vanished before she'd ever returned to Windward House? Why had the Colonel been hiding them before her arrival? The entire sequence had been too neatly aligned, too clean. It didn't fit. She sat with Cecily that afternoon in the sunroom, both of them watching the bees drift lazily over the lavender. "Do you believe it's over?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Cecily hesitated. "They've called off the investigation. Alan says we should move on. Father won't speak of it anymore." "But you're not certain?" "I'm not," Cecily admitted. "He didn't look relieved when they returned the letters. He looked afraid." Miss Marple rose from her chair and paced slowly to the hallway, eyes drifting again to the empty space above the fireplace. "And you're sure the painting hasn't turned up?" "Not a scrap," Cecily said. "He said it was burned, but there's no proof. Just the fragment the gardener found in the hedge. That fragment, charred, at the edge with the red paint smear." Miss Marple had been holding it in a small linen envelope since the day it was found. She retrieved it from her bag and studied it again that evening under lamplight. The texture was rougher than fine portrait canvas. It was closer to sackcloth, the kind used for backing or covering furniture. Had the Colonel burned the real portrait? Or had he burned something else entirely to make it look that way? She returned the next day to the frame shop, where Mr. Deering, now accustomed to her quiet inquiries, greeted her with less surprise than he might once have shown. "Did you ever see the back of the Warburton painting?" she asked. "I did once," he replied. "Years ago, when I helped hang it. Heavy frame, large staples across the back, but the curious thing was it had two linings." "Two?" "Yes. The first was stitched close to the canvas, but the second was a looser, more recent backing. I assumed it was reinforcement. But now, could a replica be fitted behind an old frame convincingly?" Deering paused, then nodded. "If you wanted it to pass a quick glance, yes. Especially if the painting wasn't examined up close." Miss Marple's thoughts returned to that strange moment when she had triggered the hidden wall panel. There had been a cloth and a frame, but no painting, not the original. A substitute had been placed there, possibly to stage its disappearance, to suggest it had been stolen or destroyed, when in fact it had never left the house. She walked home briskly, mind tightening like a drawstring. Back at her cottage, she wrote a brief letter, requesting Cecily and Alan come to tea the next day. When they arrived, she asked one simple question. "Do you trust your father's safe?" Alan frowned. "He guards it like a dragon. But no, I wouldn't call it unbreachable." "Why?" "Because I believe the real painting may still be in the house. Not in the study. Somewhere less obvious." She laid out her reasoning, how the authorities had accepted a version of events based on superficial evidence, how the letters looked too clean, how the timing didn't match the narrative. If the painting was never truly destroyed, then it might still contain something, perhaps not letters, but something far more damaging. Cecily looked up. "Like what?" Miss Marple met her gaze. "A will, or a confession. Something your mother wanted protected more than her reputation." That evening, with Cecily's reluctant blessing, Alan distracted the Colonel with a fictitious call from the solicitor regarding a land dispute. Miss Marple, escorted quietly by Phelps, slipped into the linen attic, the only part of the house untouched during the chaos. There, behind the stacked boxes of tablecloths and winter quilts, she found a narrow cupboard. Inside, wrapped in plain canvas and tied with frayed twine, was the painting. She opened it slowly. The portrait of Millicent Warburton stared back, unsmiling, hollow-eyed. But at the bottom edge, along the inner stretcher, was a flap of paper sewn beneath the lining. Miss Marple peeled it back. Folded, there was a thin envelope, yellowed and sealed with brittle wax. She opened it by candlelight. It was not a letter to a lover. It was a document. A codicil to the Colonel's will, dated 6 months before Millicent's death, redirecting the estate not to Cecily, but to another name, Daniel Sedley, the painter. "For the child who bears my blood, though not my husband's name, it read. May the truth outlive the portrait." Miss Marple stepped back, the painting watching her as if aware it had finally spoken. The next morning, the house was quiet. The colonel, having received a courtesy visit from the constable congratulating him on the matter's conclusion, had returned to his armchair with a satisfied scowl. But when Miss Marple arrived, the satisfaction drained from his face. "I found the real painting," she said, placing the document on the table, "and I believe your wife intended this to be found when the time was right." He stared at the paper, then up at her. "It's a forgery," he said flatly. "No," she replied. "This one's real. You faked the letters. But this carries the weight of your wife's final word." And though he did not rise and did not rage, he said nothing else. Just stared, jaw clenched, as Miss Marple folded her hands and said quietly, "The case may be closed, Colonel, but the truth is only just emerging." The air inside Windward House had turned dense with unspoken things. After Miss Marple's revelation, Colonel Warburton had not spoken a word to anyone for nearly 2 days. Cecily reported that he remained locked in the study most hours, emerging only for meals, his steps heavier, his eyes sunk farther back. The codicil had not yet been shown to the solicitor. Alan, cautious but insistent, urged Cecily to make a certified copy and keep it separate from the original, in case the colonel acted rashly. Miss Marple agreed. She had seen the look of a man cornered not by the law, but by memory, a far less forgiving captor. She returned home with a mind burdened not with victory but with questions. The truth of Millicent's child, conceived with the painter Sedley and acknowledged in that codicil, was a bomb buried for years, set to explode not in court but inside the brittle foundation of the Warburton family. Yet something still gnawed at Miss Marple. The forged letters presented by Mrs. Hargrave, the false confession, the portrait's hidden survival. All of it had been so carefully staged. But for what? If the colonel truly believed he had concealed the codicil forever, why create a false trail of letters at all? Why lure the police into a premature conclusion? Miss Marple took a walk that evening to clear her mind, ending up almost instinctively at the village hall. Inside was a modest community archive kept under the care of the local history society. She asked to see the artist's registry from the 1920s and 30s, and there, among the dog-eared pages, was the name she had expected, Daniel Sedley. But to her surprise, she found another name linked beside it, Yvonne Hargrave, listed not as a friend or benefactor, but as a patron and owner of several works. A footnote described a short-lived exhibition held in Bath in 1934 under the title Visions in Solitude. 3 paintings listed under Sedley's name had since disappeared from public record. Miss Marple borrowed a catalogue from the archive and sat by the window flipping through its pages. In the middle was a grainy reproduction of a piece titled In Mourning. The woman in the painting, seated and veiled, bore more than a passing resemblance to Millicent Warburton. But what held Miss Marple's gaze was the child in the corner, barely visible, face turned, standing beside a wicker cradle. There was no doubt in her mind. The subject of that painting was Millicent, and the child was the one she had never spoken of. This was not a portrait for display, it was a record, a confession in oil and shadow. The pieces began to shift. She returned to the vicarage the next morning and asked for any death notices or parish reports from that year. The vicar, ever helpful, produced a folder of handwritten notes, and there, dated just 4 days after the Bath exhibition, was a report of Sedley's death. Accidental drowning, body found near the Avon. No foul play suspected. It was too neat, too quiet. An artist who had painted a portrait of a mother and her secret child, who had ties to both the colonel's wife and to Mrs. Hargrave, dead, just as whispers began. Miss Marple sat back, her mind now tracing a different path. Yvonne Hargrave had not come merely for sentiment. She had once owned Sedley's paintings. She had once stood beside Millicent, But why had she truly returned now? To collect the letters, yes. But what if she had come back for something more? Perhaps she had known about the codicil. Perhaps she believed it proved that her friend's child had a rightful inheritance. Or perhaps she feared it would expose something far worse. She visited Cecily again that afternoon. They sat in the garden, a late wind shaking dry petals from the rose arch. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did your mother ever speak of Sedley or Bath?" "Not to me," Cecily said. "But I remember something. Once, years ago, when I was maybe 12, I found a box of old photographs in the attic. There was one of her with a man, dark hair, tall, holding a paintbrush. I asked who he was, and she said, 'Just an old friend who disappeared before you were born.' That was all. Did she burn the photograph? No. But I never found the box again." Miss Marple stood. "There's more to this than your father's guilt. Someone else has been circling this house, watching, waiting." Later that day, a letter arrived at the Colonel's door. No postmark, just a folded note delivered by hand. The housekeeper, puzzled, brought it to Cecily. Inside was a single sentence written in familiar looping script. "You always believed the canvas held. Your shame, but I know the truth still lies buried in paint and bone alike." Miss Marple saw it and knew immediately. The forgery hadn't been meant to fool the police. It had been meant to smoke out the Colonel. The real player behind the scenes hadn't been Warburton or even Yvonne Hargrave. Someone else had been watching from the shadows. Someone with a deeper tie to Sedley, to Millicent, to the child who had vanished from record. Perhaps not a child at all by now. Perhaps grown. Perhaps bitter. Perhaps close. She returned to the archive and flipped again through the catalogue of Visions in Solitude, this time examining the list of attendees. There, at the bottom, was a curious annotation. David Harrow, Assistant Curator. Harrow. A name. Unfamiliar until she recalled Mrs. Hargrave's maiden name. Yvonne Harrow. Not a patron, then. A sister. Or a mother. The child had never died. The stillbirth record had been a lie. Planted, perhaps, to appease the Colonel's pride. And the codicil wasn't just about inheritance, it was about identity. Somewhere nearby, someone had spent years quietly gathering fragments of a life denied to them, waiting for the moment to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs, not with violence, not with scandal, but with pressure, guilt, and exposure. Miss E. Marple closed the book. This was no longer a case about a missing painting. It was about a missing person. Someone raised not with a name, but with a truth too heavy to carry, and now ready to step from the shadows. It was during her morning walk past the mill pond that Miss Marple's idea crystallized, not fully formed, but instinctively right. The pieces of the puzzle were too carefully arranged to trust appearances. The false letters, the missing painting, the sudden emergence of Mrs. Hargrave, and now the ghost of a child who may have never died, all of it pointed not to a spontaneous crime, but to a constructed one. Someone had orchestrated the recent events with a careful hand, counting on the Colonel's silence, the police's eagerness to resolve the case, and the emotional weight of buried shame to muddy the waters. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to tip the balance, not with accusations, but with an illusion of discovery. She would invite them to reveal themselves not by pressing, but by pretending not to see. She began by paying another visit to Mr. Deering at the frame shop, asking for a small favour. She needed a near-identical frame to the one that had held the Warburton portrait, aged and weathered, and, if possible, with a concealed space behind the backing. Mr. Deering, curious but obliging, had it prepared by the next afternoon. She wrapped it carefully and brought it to Windward House in a plain brown cloth, telling Cecily she intended to conduct a small experiment that required complete discretion. That evening, while the Colonel retired early with his usual brandy, Miss Marple asked Cecily to bring Alan and Mrs. Finch into the study, along with Phelps. There, Under the pretense of sorting through remaining loose ends, Miss Marple drew back the cloth and revealed the frame. "This," she said mildly, "was discovered yesterday behind the vestry wall at the church. It seems someone left it, there intact and untouched. The canvas itself had been removed, but we believe something was concealed behind it." Alan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Cecily looked puzzled. Mrs. Finch narrowed her eyes and leaned closer, but it was Phelps who blinked too hard, his mouth tightening before he looked away. Miss Marple noticed. She said nothing of his reaction. Instead, she continued smoothly, "We've not opened the backing yet. I thought it better to bring it here first. If it proves to contain something, we can inform the solicitor together." No one spoke. Then, slowly, Phelps stepped forward. "Would you like me to fetch a knife, madam?" "No need," Miss Marple said gently. "It's already been opened at the archive, just resealed for privacy. What's interesting is that it had a note tucked behind it." Now all eyes were on her. "A note?" Alan asked. "Yes," she said. "A rather touching one, from a mother to her child, something about blood speaking louder than names." There was a shift, tiny but telling, in the air. Not from Cecily, who looked confused, nor from Mrs. Finch, who appeared genuinely moved. But Alan, calm, composed, always steady, exhaled a fraction too deeply, as though a weight had unexpectedly pressed against his ribs. Miss Marple fixed her gaze on him, though her voice remained light. "Of course, we don't know the full meaning yet. It may be unrelated, but it suggests the painting was only part of the plan. Perhaps a message left for someone still searching for answers." Alan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Cecily, noticing his silence, turned to him with narrowed eyes. "Is there something you're not telling me?" He began, then steadied himself. "I just wonder how it ended up at the church." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Especially since the vicar had no record of anything being placed there, which suggests someone wanted it to be found, but only at the right moment." She let the words hang. After dismissing the others gently, Miss Marple asked to speak with Phelps alone in the kitchen. The butler, stiff but courteous, waited for her to begin. "I know you saw the real portrait after it was removed," she said quietly, "and I suspect you know more than you've let on." He hesitated, then sighed. "I did see it, madam, but I didn't understand what it meant. There was something behind the canvas. I couldn't read the whole thing, only a name, Sedley. When I asked the colonel about it, he said it was a forgery, but he burned it that same night. Or so he said." "Did you see him burn it?" "No. Only the ashes in the hearth." Miss Marple leaned closer. "And when did Mr. Morley arrive at the house the first time?" Phelps frowned. "The day before Miss Cecily returned. He came unannounced. Said he wanted to speak to the colonel in private." "And he stayed how long?" "An hour, no more. Then left abruptly." The colonel looked shaken. Miss Marple thanked him and left. Her path was now clear. The crack in the illusion had widened. Alan Morley, the well-spoken fiancé, had come to Windward House long before he was expected, and not to propose. He had come to warn, to negotiate, or to threaten. Perhaps all three. She now believed he wasn't just engaged to Cecily by chance. He had inserted himself into the Warburton household with a purpose, whether out of genuine grievance, inheritance, ambition, or long-brewing vengeance remained to be seen. But he had known what the portrait contained, or believed he did. The next morning she invited Alan for a quiet stroll through the village lanes. He agreed, seemingly unaware that her manner, so warm and grandmotherly, was pressing inward now with quiet purpose. "Did you love her before you met her? Miss Marple asked gently as they passed the pond. Alan smiled faintly. "Cecily?" "No," she said. "Millicent." He stopped walking. Miss Marple continued before he could speak. It must be strange meeting the daughter of a woman you may never have known, but always heard about. Harder still if the woman left behind questions no one would answer. Alan's face was unreadable now, but his jaw was tight. She wasn't cruel, Miss Marple added. She made a difficult choice, and the Colonel, well, he made a worse one, but punishing Cecily won't undo any of it. His voice, when it came, was low. I never meant to punish her. No, Miss Marple said softly, but you meant to take something back. Maybe not money, maybe not the house, but truth. Alan looked away. He lied about her, about what she meant, about what she left behind. And you found out, eventually, from my aunt, from records, from that dreadful exhibition? Miss Marple nodded. Then I suggest you tell Cecily everything. Because if you don't, the truth will come through in other ways and destroy her trust in both of you. Alan said nothing more, but his silence no longer held power. It was crumbling. That night, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, tea cooling beside her. The unconventional clue, an empty frame, a fabricated letter, a false discovery, had done its job. The mask had slipped, just enough to show the eyes beneath it. The next move would not come from her. It would come from those who had buried the past, and those who had clawed their way back to the surface to claim it. It was the knock on her door just past midnight that confirmed what Miss Marple had feared all day. Cecily stood in the shadows of the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, her face pale and taut. She didn't wait to be asked inside. "It's gone," she said as soon as the door opened. "The codicil. I kept the copy in the drawer of my writing desk. I was going to take it to the solicitor in the morning, but now someone's taken it." Miss Marple didn't ask who had access. She already knew the answer. Windward House was a fortress, not because of its locks, but because everyone who entered it thought they were safe behind silence. They sat together in the parlour, the window panes rattling faintly in the night wind. Cecily's hands trembled as she spoke. "I went to Alan after our walk. I asked him directly what you implied. He didn't deny it. He told me he knew my mother, that she once wrote to someone in his family, his aunt Yvonne Hargrave. He said she had been looking for him in a way, that she never got the chance. He told me he loved me, but he came here with questions first, not answers." Miss Marple listened carefully. "And when did you last see the copy of the codicil?" "This afternoon, after we spoke. I checked it before dinner. It was still there. Then after my father went to bed, I went to move it to my wardrobe, and it was gone. Nothing else disturbed, just the envelope." Miss Marple didn't need to ask whether the original remained with the Colonel. That had been locked away from the start, and now, with the only copy gone, any leverage Cecily might have had was fading. The balance was tipping again, toward concealment, toward silence, toward forgetting. But someone had taken it deliberately. Not the Colonel, who would have simply destroyed it. Not Cecily, who had every reason to protect it. That left only one possibility. Alan had known about it, perhaps even read it. And now, someone was making certain no one else would. Early the next morning, Miss Marple returned to Windward House with a purpose sharper than any before. The house was unusually quiet. Cecily was not in the garden, Phelps not at his post. She was about to ask Mrs. Finch when the woman appeared, visibly distressed. "Mr. Morley left at dawn, madam. Took the road to Paddington. Said he'd return. In 2 days, Miss Cecily tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple felt a tension settle in her chest. He was running, not away, but ahead. Perhaps to secure something, perhaps to bury it. But why leave now if he'd already taken the codicil? Unless he hadn't taken it. The thought reversed everything. If Alan hadn't stolen the document, then who had? She asked for Phelps and was told he had gone into the village on errands. But when Miss Marple stepped into the study, she noticed something strange. Faint scuff marks near the hearth and a thin trace of ash, not from last night's fire, but older, drier. She bent and touched it with her fingertip. Cold. Someone had used the fireplace again, but not recently. A quick, unsanctioned burn. She looked toward the desk. The lock on the lower drawer had been forced recently. It was subtle, but the edge had splintered slightly beneath the varnish. And inside the wastebasket, almost invisible beneath crumpled blotting paper, was a scrap of envelope corner, torn, yellowed, faintly embossed with the letterhead of Hawthorne and Blythe, solicitors. The same firm named in the codicil. She took the scrap and returned to her cottage, her mind working in cold, precise spirals. Whoever had taken the codicil wanted not just to suppress it, but to ensure it could not be recovered again. If the Colonel had done it, he would have left no trace. If Alan had done it, he would not have fled. That left only one person who had motive and opportunity, yet had not drawn suspicion. Phelps. He had been loyal to the Colonel for years, but loyalty can sour into complicity, and complicity over time curdles into something more desperate. Fear. Miss Marple waited until dusk and then walked to the lodge house, where Phelps lived in the modest quarters near the garden wall. He answered in shirt sleeves, surprised but not alarmed. "I thought you might be busy with guests, madam." "Not tonight," she said. "I came about the codicil." His expression didn't shift, but his hands moved, a small, reflexive twitch toward the side table, where a folded newspaper lay. A poor cover. The man was nervous. "Miss Cecily believes it was Alan," she said calmly, "but I wonder if you might help clarify something." "I don't know anything about it," he said too quickly. "You've always protected this family," she said gently, "even from itself. But I'm afraid that time has passed." He shook his head. "I never meant harm. He asked me to watch the desk. Said he'd misplaced something. I saw the envelope. I thought if I took it, maybe I could stop him from doing something foolish." "Did you give it to him?" "No," Phelps said. "I burned it." There it was. The truth. Raw and sad. Miss Marple's voice softened. "You burned a legal document, Mr. Phelps. But more than that, you burned a child's name. That name might not belong to Cecily, but it belongs to someone." His face twisted, old grief rising. It would have torn her apart. To learn she had a brother, a claim against the house, a man she was about to marry, with more reason than affection. Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, you've only delayed the reckoning." She left him standing in his doorway, the night swallowing, his silhouette. The codicil was gone, yes, but the truth had already taken root. Cecily would come to understand that the loss of the document did not erase the past. It only sharpened the lines around it. And Alan, wherever he had gone, would find that stories built on secrets always collapse beneath their own weight. As Miss Marple returned home, the wind picked up through the hedgerows. The painting was gone, the evidence burned, but the truth clung to Windward House like ivy to stone. She no longer needed a courtroom. The players had revealed themselves, and the end, she knew, would come not with revelation, but with choice. The following morning began with a kind of silence that doesn't settle but presses. The sky over Lymstock was heavy and close, a low grey dome that seemed to muffle everything beneath it. Miss Marple, up earlier than usual, had just sat down to her tea when the knock came. Urgent, not polite. Mrs. Finch stood at the threshold, her apron damp, her eyes wide and unfocused. She didn't step inside, but instead breathed. "It's the Colonel. He's gone. He didn't sleep in his bed last night. and the study doors open, wide open. Miss Marple set her cup down and rose without a word. They walked back together, neither speaking, the air between them laced with a kind of suspended panic. At Windward House, Phelps hovered near the stairs, pale and wringing his hands. Cecily stood in the corridor, mouth slightly open, arms folded, as if holding herself together. Miss Marple went directly to the study. The door stood ajar. Inside, the room was dim, the curtains still drawn. But something had changed. The fireplace was cold, and the safe, usually hidden discreetly behind. The bookshelf panel was gaping open, empty. Miss Marple moved to the desk. The top drawer was unlocked, its contents undisturbed. But on the blotter lay a torn envelope with the seal of Hawthorne and Blythe again, identical in design to the first. This one, though, had been ripped hastily, as if someone had opened it in fury or panic, and beside it was a single sheet of notepaper. Not a codicil, a letter, dated 2 days prior, addressed to Cecily. She did not read it. Instead, she turned to the hearth and knelt beside the ashes. Unlike before, these were still warm, just faintly. She reached into them with the poker and lifted a corner of paper that had not been fully consumed. It bore the words, "Forgive what cannot be reversed," and beneath that, "You must not trust the one who," then charred black. Behind her, footsteps. "I didn't know he'd gone," Cecily said quietly. Miss Marple rose. "He left in the night, likely after everyone had gone to sleep. Took something from the safe. Perhaps the original codicil. Perhaps something more." They stood for a moment in silence, the weight of the empty room between them. "Where would he go?" Cecily asked. Miss Marple shook her head. "I don't know, but I believe he meant to end it." The search began quickly. The constable, summoned by Mrs. Finch, organized a sweep of the woods beyond the orchard. Alan had still not returned, and the timing of his absence gnawed at Miss Marple's thoughts. The colonel had vanished with whatever truth he held, and now, more than ever, she feared that silence was not his final act, but only the prelude to something worse. By noon, they found the car. It was parked beside the old quarry road, quiet, untouched, keys still in the ignition. Inside, the colonel's walking stick lay across the passenger seat. No footprints led into the quarry. No sign of disturbance. Just the car, abandoned. The constable feared the worst and began scouring the edges of the quarry itself, fearing a fall, perhaps deliberate. But Miss Marple said nothing. She stood at the tree line, watching the scene unfold, and felt in her bones that this was not a death site. It was a staging ground. That evening, as dusk fell again, a new arrival brought chaos. A telegram addressed to the vicarage and hand-delivered by the postmaster contained only a few jarring lines. Alan Morley found unconscious in Bath hotel room. Injuries to the head. Wallet missing. No sign of forced entry. Police investigating. Sato. Marple read it twice, then folded it slowly, so the colonel hadn't vanished to destroy himself. He had gone to silence someone else. Or perhaps someone else had acted first. She made the journey to Bath the next morning with Cecily. They found Alan in a hospital room, bandaged, pale but awake. He looked up at Cecily without surprise, then turned to Miss Marple. "It wasn't your father," he said weakly. "I never saw who it was." Miss Marple sat beside him. "What were you doing in Bath?" "I was meeting a solicitor," he said. "One connected to Sedley's estate. There was a trust, something my aunt had access to. She left it to me before she died. I thought there might be something else, some record, some letter, something I missed. Did you find it?" Alan nodded, then winced. "A deposition. From Sedley himself. Never filed. He'd written it before he died. A statement naming the child he believed was his. Millicent was never meant to destroy it. She had hidden it with someone she trusted, a solicitor who later passed it to the firm in Bath. I read it and then—" His hand trembled. "I was struck from behind. When I woke, it was gone." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Do you remember the wording?" "Only the last sentence," Alan murmured. "I do this not for my name, but for the child who will never know it." Miss Marple left the hospital room with a certainty she had not possessed before. Someone had been following the trail all along, not to inherit, not to reconcile, but to erase. They had waited through decades of secrets and silence, and now, with everything unraveling, they were closing the gaps violently. Back in Lymstock, Phelps was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Finch said he hadn't returned home the night before. His lodge was locked, his bed undisturbed. A search was launched again, this time not for a body, but for a man running out of time. Miss Marple walked alone through the village paths, retracing old memories, not of the case, but of all the quiet things Phelps had ever said. His closeness to the Colonel, his access to the study, his unexplained knowledge of what should have been secrets. And suddenly it made sense. Phelps hadn't protected the Colonel. He had protected the story, and now someone had tried to end it, with Alan. A second crime, not random, precise. And Phelps had vanished into the fog like a man who knew too much and could say too little, or like a man who had written one too many lies into the fire. Miss Marple stood at the gate of Windward House that evening and knew the case had changed. It wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about control, about history being weaponized, and if they didn't stop it now, someone else would be next. It was well past midnight when Miss Marple returned to her cottage, but sleep would not come. She sat by the window with a shawl around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the silent garden. Beyond the glass, her thoughts chasing threads through a tangle of lies and disappearances. The Colonel was missing, Alan had nearly been killed, and Phelps, the one man whose loyalty had seemed absolute, had vanished without explanation. Everyone was a step behind something, yet something had just shifted. Not a major revelation. Not yet, but a sensation, a feeling that something already seen had been misunderstood. She closed her eyes and let the days replay. The false codicil, the missing portrait, the forged letters, Alan's admission, the quarried car, the charred envelope, the cold fireplace. And then one thread flickered, the note found in the hearth. "You must not trust the one who—" She had assumed the message had been intended for Cecily. But what if it wasn't? What if that note wasn't left to be read at all? At dawn, Miss Marple rose and walked to Windward House, early enough that even the birds hadn't begun their full chorus. Cecily was awake, in the parlour with an untouched cup of tea. Her eyes looked like they'd not seen rest in 2 nights. "He's still gone," she said quietly. No word, no trace. Miss Marple didn't speak at first. She stood by the window, watching the breeze stir the ivy on the outer wall. Then she turned back. "Do you recall what Phelps said to you, just once, about the Colonel's routine in winter?" Cecily blinked. "What do you mean?" "There was a remark, in passing. I remember it because it was so ordinary. He said your father never used the front fireplace in winter because it smoked. Do you recall that?" "Yes. We always kept it unused during the colder months. Why?" "But the ashes we found," Miss Marple said softly, "were in the front fireplace, the one in the study, which he never used, which means someone else used it." Cecily frowned, and slowly her face began to change. "I believe Phelps started that fire," Miss Marple continued, "but not to burn the codicil. I think he meant us to find something, or to think we had, but it wasn't the truth he was hiding. It was a misdirection. And that note, the one half-burned, wasn't to Cecily at all. It was to the Colonel." A silence settled. "And then," Cecily whispered, "you think Phelps was trying to warn him?" "I do," Miss Marple said, And perhaps he's still trying. That's why he's vanished, not to escape, but to find the Colonel before someone else does. Cecily stood, a sudden urgency rising. But who else would be looking for him? Miss Marple didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Where are the old household records kept? The ones from before your mother died?" "In the attic," Cecily said, eyes narrowing. "But no one's gone through those in years." Together they climbed the stairs, the dust of the past clinging to every step. In the far corner of the attic sat an old cedar chest. Inside were ledgers, inventory lists, and a bundle of photographs. Cecily knelt and opened the bundle, flipping through images of garden parties, military dinners and charity events. Then one photograph caught Miss Marple's attention. She took it, studied it, then looked at Cecily. "This was taken here, yes?" "Yes. That's the old rose garden, just before the hedge wall was rebuilt." Miss Marple pointed at the man standing behind Millicent, tall in uniform, but not the Colonel. "A young man with a sharp face and careful stance. Who is he?" Cecily looked closer. That's Charles Mayhew. He was our groundskeeper for a while. My mother knew him from before she married. I think they grew up in the same village. He left the year after I was born." Miss Marple said nothing but took another photograph from the box. This one was smaller. The same man appeared again, this time alone, beside a painting mounted on an easel. A portrait, unfinished, of Millicent. A long, slow breath escaped Miss Marple's lips. It wasn't Daniel Sedley who had painted the original portrait, or at least not alone. She looked at the edges of the photograph. Faded writing marked the back. For M, from C. Mayhew, 1935 C. Mayhew, Charles Mayhew. But Phelps's full name, as she had overheard once from Mrs. Finch when calling him upstairs, was Charles Phelps. She rose. "Cecily," she said carefully, "do you know what your mother's name was before she married?" Cecily furrowed her brow. "Yes, Millicent Harrow." Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she held the photograph. "And your father always referred to Mrs. Hargrave as an old family friend." "He hated her, actually," Cecily said. "He said she interfered in things that weren't hers." Miss Marple exhaled. The name, Harrow, the Harrow in Yvonne, Hargrave, Millicent's sister or cousin. And Charles Mayhew, Phelps, was more than a servant. He was family, a cousin, a half-brother, someone folded into the household not by employment, but by design. Someone who had been watching, shielding, and stepping in when shadows moved. They descended from the attic in silence, the weight of the past heavy on every step. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, a knock sounded at the door. Phelps. Untar stood with leaves in his hair, coat torn, and an expression of quiet resolve. "He's alive," he said, "in a safe place. But you need to know something. He was never meant to be the villain. He took the portrait down because he realized what it contained: names, inheritance papers, letters. But not the ones you think." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Who were they addressed to?" "To me," Phelps said. "He found them and knew the truth. That I was Millicent's half-brother. That she gave the portrait to Sedley for safekeeping, not because of the painting, but because of what she stitched behind it. Sedley passed it to me before he died, but I buried it. For years. And when the Colonel began to suspect, I returned. As a servant. He kept me close not because he trusted me, but because he needed to. He was afraid of what I remembered." "And what do you remember?" Miss Marple asked softly. Phelps met her gaze. "That Millicent tried to protect her son. Not the Colonel's. Not mine. Hers and Sedley's. Alan." It fell into place like the final click of a lock turning. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. So, the pattern was always there. a forged identity, a hidden heir, a quiet observer, playing protector all along. The painting wasn't just a clue, it was a mirror, and everyone who looked into it saw only what they were afraid to admit. Phelps nodded. But someone still wants it buried, and they're not done. Miss Marple turned to Cecily, who stood, frozen, pale, the portrait of her mother now reshaped entirely in her mind. And Miss Marple knew. The last move in this game would not be made by logic, nor proof. It would be made by emotion, by someone unwilling to lose what they had stolen. And they would strike again soon. The evening air was cool, but inside Windward House the tension hung heavy, thick with unsaid things. Cecily sat in the drawing room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Miss Marple had been right about everything. The painting, the letters, the hidden past, and even Phelps's role in the story. But there was still one piece left to uncover. One motive that was still buried beneath layers of fear and shame. It had all started as a mystery about inheritance and family, but it had grown into something much darker. As the clock struck 10, a quiet knock at the door interrupted the stillness. Cecily's eyes flickered with recognition, and Miss Marple rose before she could react. It was Mrs. Finch, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple, Miss Cecily," she said in a low voice, "it's the Colonel. He's back." The shock of it hit them both like a wave. "Where is he?" Cecily managed, her voice trembling. "In the study," Mrs. Finch said. Her words rushed, her gaze darting around as though expecting someone to pounce. "He's been sitting there since just after dusk, staring at the fireplace. Not a word to anyone, just sitting there. I thought—" "Wait," Miss Marple interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You said he's been sitting there since dusk?" "Yes," Mrs. Finch said, blinking, her voice shaking. "And he keeps muttering to himself. Something about not being the man they thought. He's not the same." Miss Marple nodded and motioned for Cecily to stay put. She stepped forward, her footsteps sure and measured as she made her way to the study. The door was ajar. The Colonel sat by the fire, a pale shadow in the dim room, his figure hunched and unnaturally still. His eyes were open but unfocused, and his hands were clasped tightly in his lap. "Colonel Warburton," Miss Marple said softly, entering without, waiting for an invitation. His head turned slowly, and his eyes fixed on her as though he had only just realized she was there. There was no recognition in his gaze, only a deep, weary emptiness. "Miss Marple," he rasped, his voice hoarse, I didn't think you'd come. I didn't think anyone would." "Why wouldn't I come?" Miss Marple asked gently, moving closer. "You're not the one I'm after, Colonel." "Don't lie to me," he muttered. "You're all after me. After what I've done. What I should have done years ago." Miss Marple remained quiet, watching him carefully. His expression wasn't one of guilt. It was something deeper, something almost defeated. Finally, he looked away from her and stared into the fire, his fingers twitching at his sides. His next words came out in a rush. "It wasn't about the money, not at all. I didn't care about the inheritance or the house or any of it. I thought it was about her, about Millicent. But I was wrong. It was never her. It was about keeping him away." Miss Marple took a step forward, her voice soft but deliberate. "Who, Colonel? Who were you trying to keep away?" "The boy," he said, his voice cracking. "The child, the one I thought was dead." There it was, the truth finally uncovered. "You didn't think he had died," Miss Marple said quietly, "because he didn't. He grew up. And you did everything in your power to hide him, to erase him, because you couldn't bear to face what Millicent had done." The Colonel's face crumpled with pain. "She loved him, she always did. Even when I married her, she never loved Me, she loved him, but he wasn't mine. He wasn't my son. She didn't tell me, but I knew. I knew it from the moment I looked at him. The boy from the painting. The boy who should have been my heir. Miss Marple's gaze softened with understanding. You tried to keep him from taking what was yours, Colonel. You didn't just destroy a painting or hide a letter. You tried to erase a part of her, her child. And when you couldn't, you hid the truth, buried it, locked it away with your pride. He didn't respond, his eyes now fixed on the flames. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a spectre. Miss Marple felt a pang of pity for him, but it was fleeting, replaced quickly by something sharper, a realization that was beginning to take shape. "There's more, isn't there?" Miss Marple said quietly. "You didn't just hide the boy, Colonel. You hid a secret you couldn't bear anyone knowing. A secret that would have shattered everything." The Colonel's head snapped up, his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "Millicent wasn't just hiding a child. She was hiding your child. A son you couldn't acknowledge, because acknowledging him meant acknowledging the truth about what had happened between you and her before you were married. Millicent wasn't the only one with a past." The Colonel's face went pale. "You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Miss Marple said softly, her voice still as steady as ever. "Your marriage wasn't just a union of convenience. It was the result of a secret Millicent kept from everyone, including you. The boy you thought was your son wasn't. But that didn't change the fact that you couldn't bear to see him raised in the shadow of your failure." "I couldn't let him have it all," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let him take everything from me. After all I'd done to keep up appearances, to protect our family name, I couldn't let that one mistake haunt me forever." Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment. The puzzle had finally clicked into place. She understood now why the Colonel had acted the way he did, why he'd protected the secret of his wife's infidelity with such fury. It wasn't just pride. It was fear. Fear of losing his legacy, his identity, and his control over the life he had worked so hard to build. "And so you destroyed everything that could prove it," Miss Marple said gently. "The painting, the codicil, the letters, anything that might expose what Millicent had tried to hide. You thought if you could bury the truth it would go away. But it hasn't, Colonel. It never will." The Colonel's shoulders slumped. His face twisted in a mixture of sorrow and regret. "I should have told her. I should have told her everything. But I was too proud, too scared. And now it's too late." Miss Marple looked at him not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding. "It is never too late, Colonel. Not for the truth." He looked up at her, the final remnants of his defenses crumbling. "What do I do now?" Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already moving forward. "You can't undo the past, but you can choose to live with the truth and let others decide what to do with it. You've spent your life protecting a lie, Colonel. It's time to stop." As Miss Marple turned to leave the study, she glanced back at the Colonel. His eyes were filled with defeat, but also, for the first time in years, a flicker of something else, hope. He wasn't free yet, but he might be closer than he ever had been. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, Miss Marple felt the last piece of the puzzle slip into place. The pattern was no longer a mystery. The game was up. The truth had won. The air in Windward House had grown heavy once more, thick with the weight of inevitable confrontation. Miss Marple had seen it before, how the truth once revealed could create a storm that swept everyone within its reach. The Colonel, broken yet resolute, had finally acknowledged his role in the tangled mess of lies and deceit. But the real test was yet to come. The final confrontation, where the past and present would meet, where the remaining secrets would finally emerge from their hiding places, and the villain, whoever they were, would have nowhere left to retreat. It was nearly dusk when Miss Marple returned to Windward House. The evening sky painted with a muted palette of oranges and purples. The kind of sky that always seemed to promise an ending, but not a beginning. Cecily was waiting for her in the drawing room, her face pale, her expression taut with anticipation. "Has he spoken to you?" Miss Marple asked gently, taking a seat across from her. "No," Cecily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He won't talk to anyone but you. He says he's too ashamed to face me. But I think he knows what's coming." "What he has to face?" Miss Marple nodded. "He does, but there's still one more piece to uncover." Cecily looked at her, her eyes searching. "What do you mean? I thought the Colonel admitted everything." "He admitted what he wanted to admit," Miss Marple said softly. "But not the whole truth. Not yet." The truth had a way of twisting and curling in on itself, like a serpent coiling tighter with every word spoken, every confession made. The Colonel had confessed to hiding the child, to hiding his wife's secret. But there was something more, something darker, beneath it all. Something that tied everything together, something that had been there from the very beginning. Miss Marple stood and moved toward the study, her footsteps quiet on the worn carpet. She turned the handle slowly, and the door creaked open. Inside, the Colonel sat by the fire again, his gaze distant, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He hadn't moved since their last conversation, and his face seemed even more drawn, more worn than before. "Colonel," Miss Marple said softly, stepping into the room, "I believe we're at the end of this long road, the end of the lies and the silence. It's time to face what you've hidden for so long." The Colonel's head jerked up and his eyes flickered with fear. "I've already told you everything, Miss Marple. What more do you want from me?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "You've told me your version of the truth. But there's more, Colonel. There's a reason you've hidden the truth about the boy, a reason you've kept everyone in the dark. And there's someone else who has been pulling the strings all along." The Colonel's face tightened, his mouth setting in a grim line. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your guilt," Miss Marple said, her voice low but firm. "Your guilt, not just for hiding the child, but for what happened to him. You knew all along. You just didn't want to face it." The Colonel's hands shook, his knuckles white as he clenched them tighter. "What are you accusing me of, Edward? I'm accusing you of more than just hiding the boy. I'm accusing you of letting him disappear, letting him be erased. You didn't just burn the painting and the letters, you burned the evidence of your own guilt." The Colonel stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, his face contorted with rage and fear. "Enough, Miss Marple. You don't know what you're talking about. I didn't erase him. I didn't—" "But you did," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice growing sharper. "You let him go. You allowed him to fade from the world, to disappear into nothingness. And why? Because you couldn't face the truth that you were not the only man Millicent loved. The truth that Sedley's son was the one you should have cared for, the one you should have protected." The Colonel's face crumpled, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the man beneath the layers of pride and arrogance, the broken man who had spent his entire life running from the truth, hiding from the consequences of his actions. He took a step back, his eyes wide with shock. "How do you know this?" he whispered. "I know because I've pieced it all together," Miss Marple said quietly. "From the portrait to the letters to the stories from the people who knew you both. Millicent never wanted to hurt you. She wanted to protect that child, but she knew you would never accept him. So she kept him hidden. And you—" She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "You buried the truth, not just to protect yourself, but to keep your pride intact." The Colonel staggered back, his hands shaking. He collapsed into the chair by the fireplace, his head bowed in defeat. "I couldn't let it happen," he muttered almost to himself. "I couldn't let her have him. I couldn't let anyone know what I had done. I was afraid. I was always afraid." Miss Marple stood before him, watching the once proud man crumble before her. "You were afraid of the truth, Colonel. But the truth doesn't go away, no matter how many years you bury it." Cecily entered the room then, her face pale but determined. She stood at the threshold, her eyes never leaving her father. "What is it, father?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What have you done? What haven't you told me?" The Colonel's eyes flickered up to meet hers, his gaze filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. "I kept you from the truth, Cecily," he said quietly. "I kept you from knowing about your brother, the child who should have been yours, the child I couldn't accept." Cecily's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "A brother? You mean Alan?" "No," the Colonel whispered. "Not Alan. Someone else. Someone who was never meant to be a part of this family. The son of Millicent and Sedley. The child who never had a name. The child I couldn't let into my life." Miss Marple stood, silently, allowing the silence to stretch out between them. The pieces were all finally in place. The Colonel had hidden the truth from everyone, from himself for so long that he had believed it would never be uncovered. But now it was. The truth was finally in the open, and there would be no escaping it. Cecily turned away from her father, her hand clutching the doorframe as she fought for control. "And what do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss..." Marple's answer was simple. "We face it, together, because the past cannot be changed. But the future is still ours to shape." The Colonel sat motionless, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. He didn't speak, didn't move. He was done running. The truth had caught up with him, and now it was time to face the consequences. Miss Marple sat quietly, by the fire, the weight of the room heavy with the culmination of so many truths. The Colonel, broken by his confessions, sat silently across from her, his face pale and drawn. Cecily, still reeling from the shock of learning about her true brother, had retreated to the corner of the room, her hands tightly clasped. The revelation had brought a strange kind of clarity to their household. And yet, as Miss Marple sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that something remained undone. She had suspected it from the moment they found the Colonel's disappearance too neatly orchestrated, from the way things had unfolded so cleanly, from the forged letters to the fire in the hearth. It all seemed almost too convenient. And now, with the Colonel's confession, everything should have felt like a victory. Yet Miss Marple's instincts told her that the story wasn't finished. There was still one final piece. As if the universe were answering her unspoken thoughts, the door to the study creaked open. Miss Marple turned, expecting to see Phelps, perhaps with another desperate apology, or Cecily needing to ask a final question. But it was neither. Instead, it was a figure Miss Marple had not anticipated. Alan Morley, his face bruised and pale, his clothes dishevelled from his hasty return to Lymstock. The very sight of him was enough to send a ripple of tension through the room. "Miss Marple," he said in a low, strained voice, his eyes darting nervously between her and the Colonel. I've come to explain." Cecily sprang to her feet, eyes wide with confusion and suspicion. "What are you doing here? You weren't supposed to come back until—" "I couldn't stay away," Alan interrupted, his voice unsteady. "Not after what happened in Bath, after what I learned." Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the room with a calm authority. "Alan, I believe we all know what happened to you in Bath. You were struck by someone who wanted you to keep quiet. But what you learned while you were there—" Alan swallowed hard. He looked at the Colonel, whose eyes had narrowed as if the walls were closing in on him again. I didn't want to believe it, Alan continued. I didn't want to admit it, but I... He stopped, his eyes darting to Miss Marple. The lawyer I was meeting in Bath. He wasn't a lawyer at all. He was someone hired by a third party to make sure I stayed out of this investigation. I think he was sent by someone connected to the Warburton family. Miss Marple sat forward, her gaze sharp. You're telling me you've been misled? Alan nodded grimly. Yes, and not just misled. I was being watched. For months I had been receiving threats. They started after I got engaged to Cecily. And then when I started asking questions about the Warburton inheritance, about the true nature of my connection to the family, the threats grew worse. The last one, just before I left for Bath, told me to stay away from Windward House. That was when I realized that someone wanted to make sure I didn't find out the truth. They were afraid of me knowing. Miss Marple's mind began to turn. She knew the truth about the Warburton family, the child, the lies. She knew that everything was spiraling toward a final revelation. But what Alan was telling her didn't add up. Someone had orchestrated a false path, and Alan had walked right into it. It wasn't just a matter of inheritance. It was something deeper, something more personal. Who do you believe is behind this? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but insistent. Alan hesitated. I didn't want to believe it, but I think it's Phelps. He was always too interested in the details, too eager to please the Colonel, and after I learned about the fake lawyer, I started thinking about all the strange things, how Phelps knew things he shouldn't, how he was always the one pushing the family's secrets under the rug. Cecily's eyes widened and she stepped forward. Phelps? But he's been with us for years. He's like family. I know, Alan said, his voice strained. But that's the point. He's been hiding in plain sight, pulling strings, when no one was looking. He's been managing the story, keeping everything in order, and when he realized I was too close to the truth, he decided to act. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the Colonel, who was still sitting by the fire, his face a mask of confusion and regret. He had been the one to confess, but perhaps there were still secrets he hadn't fully revealed. The portrait, she said, her voice low, wasn't just a symbol of your guilt, Colonel. It was the key to everything. But it wasn't just about the boy, was it? The Colonel looked up, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and resignation. What are you saying? The portrait was a way of hiding the truth, Miss Marple said, her voice steady and calm. You were never just trying to protect Cecily from the boy you thought was dead. You were hiding the connection between your wife and Phelps. Phelps wasn't just your servant. He was Millicent's brother. A half-brother, born out of a secret affair, an affair Millicent never confessed to you, but which you discovered when she tried to keep the boy hidden. But it wasn't just about protecting Cecily from a half-brother. It was about protecting yourself from a truth too painful to acknowledge. Cecily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No. Phelps? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Phelps wasn't just a servant. He was an heir, too. An heir to a legacy that Millicent had tried to bury. And when the truth started to surface, when the boy's identity became a threat to the Warburton name, Phelps made sure it stayed hidden. He manipulated the circumstances, planted false evidence, and even used Alan's engagement to gain access to the family's deepest secrets. The room was silent for a moment. The truth hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Cecily's hands were shaking as she turned to her father. You knew, didn't you? You knew Phelps was family all along. The Colonel's face twisted with something between regret and anger. I didn't want to know, he muttered. I couldn't bear to face it. I tried to erase it. But Phelps, he had a claim, and when he realized I was too weak to fight him, he took what he could. And then, as if the final layer of the truth had been peeled away, Miss Marple spoke the words that confirmed everything. "But you're not the only one hiding something, Colonel. Phelps knew the truth, but someone else was controlling this narrative. Someone who wanted to make sure it stayed buried forever." Cecily's face drained of colour as the realization hit her. Who? Who else could there be? Miss Marple's gaze turned to Alan. "There's one person who knew enough to manipulate the entire story, to use the family's darkest secrets against you, and that person was Mrs. Hargrave." Alan's face twisted with disbelief. "Yvonne?" Miss Marple nodded. Yvonne Hargrave, Millicent's sister, knew everything about the Warburtons' hidden past. She knew about the child, about Phelps, about the legacy that was never supposed to be part of this family. And when she learned that Phelps was finally trying to reveal the truth, she took matters into her own hands. Alan shook his head, clearly stunned. "But why would she go this far? What did she want?" "Power," Miss Marple said softly. She wanted to control the family's future, to keep the Warburtons from ever finding peace. And she knew the secret of the boy, the true heir. She used Phelps's loyalty, his fear, to manipulate him into doing her bidding. Cecily stood, her face pale and stricken. "Where is she now? Where is Yvonne?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "She's already gone, Cecily. But her shadow will linger, and the story will not be over until she is brought into the light." In that moment, as the last piece of the puzzle fell into place, Miss Marple knew the final confrontation wasn't just with Phelps or the Colonel. It was with the ghosts of the past, ghosts that still haunted the family, that still had the power to destroy everything. And now it was up to her to finish what she had started, to expose the full truth, and finally put an end to the Warburtons' tangled legacy. The investigation had come full circle, but something was still gnawing at Miss Marple's mind. The moment she had exposed the twisted threads of the Warburton family, the Colonel had slumped into his own regret, Alan had sought redemption, and Cecily had been left with the crushing weight of the truth. Yet there was still a gap, a lingering sense of unfinished business. Justice had not yet been served, not in the way Miss Marple knew it should be. The truth was now laid bare. Phelps, Millicent's half-brother, had hidden the legacy of the Warburtons, the secret child who should have claimed the name. The Colonel's admission had been a desperate attempt to bury the past, but what Phelps had done, the manipulation, the silent control over the family, was the true foundation of the mystery. But Miss Marple knew that the story was not yet complete. There was one final piece of the puzzle, one last thread to unravel. The room was tense as Miss Marple sat by the fire, her thoughts a whirl of calculations. She turned to Alan, who was pacing uneasily. "You're certain about your encounter with Mrs. Hargrave?" Alan stopped and met her gaze, his face drawn. "I never wanted to believe she was behind it. But the pieces fit now. She was the one pulling the strings. I knew she was too interested in the family's past, too eager to keep things quiet. But I never thought she would go this far, to push Phelps, to set the whole thing in motion." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "She has always been an opportunist, Alan. She knew more than anyone that the Warburtons' name and legacy were built on more than just blood. They were built on secrets. And she wanted her piece of the puzzle. But what happened to her? "Where did she go?" Cecily asked from the corner of the room, her voice raw. "I believe she's already disappeared," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm. "Mrs. Hargrave is not someone who can be caught easily. She's always kept herself in the shadows, manipulating things from afar. But she will make one last move. I'm certain of it." The sense of urgency hung in the air. Miss Marple stood up and motioned for them to follow her. "We need to go to the village now. Mrs. Hargrave may have already made her escape, but there's still one place where she may have left something behind. One place where her hold on the Warburton legacy will become clear." They arrived at the small village church, its doors creaking slightly in the wind. The place seemed untouched by time, its weathered stone walls standing as silent witnesses to decades of secrets. Miss Marple walked through the narrow aisles, her eyes scanning the quiet corners of the church. She reached the back, where the small altar stood beneath a stained-glass window. There, in the dusty shadows, she spotted it. A small, inconspicuous, wooden box sat on the ground, tucked away behind a forgotten pew. Miss Marple knelt down and carefully opened the lid. Inside, she found several documents, pages upon pages of carefully preserved correspondence. The first was a letter, written by Millicent herself. The second was a deed, signed with her name, transferring ownership of Windward House and the surrounding land to an unnamed beneficiary. But it wasn't the letter that gave Miss Marple the final clue. It was the third document, a faded photograph that had been slipped between the pages. It was of a young man standing beside a small child, with a stern-looking woman in the background. The man was unmistakably Phelps, but the woman, she was someone Miss Marple had only seen in passing at a village event many years ago. The woman was none other than Yvonne Hargrave, Millicent's sister. And the child standing beside them was none other than the child they had all believed dead, the boy who should have been heir to the Warburton name. "Cecily," Miss Marple said softly, holding up the photograph. "This is your true brother. The child Millicent tried to protect, the one she kept hidden from your father, from Phelps, and from everyone," Cecily gasped, her face paling as she reached for the photograph. "But how could this be?" Miss Marple's voice was steady as she explained. "Millicent gave birth to this boy long before you were born, Cecily. She had an affair with Phelps, and that child was the result. Millicent hid him away, terrified of the truth coming to light, but she didn't destroy him. She kept him hidden, in plain sight." "The portrait," Cecily whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "It was never about hiding the painting. It was about hiding him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, nodding. "The portrait was never meant to be a confession. It was a shield, a way for Millicent to protect him, to keep his existence from being discovered. She couldn't let your father know, but she couldn't let anyone forget either. So she buried it in the one place she thought would keep it safe, the family name." "But why now?" Alan asked, his voice thick with confusion. "Why did Phelps wait until now to bring this out? Why go to such extremes?" "Because Mrs. Hargrave came back," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but resolute. "She came back to claim what she thought was hers. She knew that the Warburtons' legacy was built on this secret. She wanted it for herself. She knew the painting was the key." "But the letters," Alan said, "the ones that were burned, the ones we thought were destroyed." "They weren't destroyed, Alan," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. "Phelps made sure of that. He hid the letters, kept them in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to use them. And now, with Mrs. Hargrave's influence, he thought he could take control." "And what happened to him?" Cecily asked, her voice breaking through the tension. "He made a mistake," Miss Marple said. "He underestimated the lengths Millicent was willing to go to protect the boy she loved. When he realized the truth was about to be exposed, he fled. But it wasn't to escape. It was to find something, to ensure that no one else could control the legacy." Miss Marple turned away from the box, her mind racing as she pieced together the final movements of the game. "We're not done yet. Someone still has control of this story. And it's not Phelps. It's someone who's been watching all along, as..." They returned to Windward House. The air seemed to thicken with every step they took. The house was waiting, but not for the answers Miss Marple had expected. There was still one more player in the game, and they were not done yet. When they entered the study, the last thing they expected to see was Phelps. But there he was, standing by the fire, a look of quiet resolution on his face. Behind him, the door was ajar, and in the dim light they could see something that had been hidden away for far too long. The portrait of the boy who was never meant to be seen. Phelps turned slowly, his eyes cold, yet filled with a strange sense of acceptance. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly, "for the truth to catch up with me." Miss Marple stood in the doorway, her eyes never leaving Phelps. The portrait hung behind him, the image of a child, an heir whose existence had been kept hidden, not only from the world, but from his own family. The room felt as though it had been frozen in time, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the final word, the final revelation. Phelps did not speak immediately. He stood there, his hands clasped before him, the weight of the past heavy in his posture. He had the look of a man who had waited for this moment, perhaps for years, knowing that the truth could no longer be contained. He'd been the keeper of secrets, but now, with the final pieces in place, he had no choice but to face the consequences of what he had done. Miss Marple took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "It's over, Phelps," she said, her voice calm, yet filled with the gravity of the moment. "The truth is out. You can't hide it anymore." He didn't flinch. "No, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "It's not over. Not yet." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Phelps finally moved, stepping toward the portrait. He ran his fingers lightly along the frame, as though it held a memory he could not quite release. "You think you know everything," he said almost to himself. "You think this is the end of the story. But it isn't. There's always something more." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The faintest chill ran down her spine, though her expression remained composed. She had always been able to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her that this case was not finished, not in the way she thought. "What more is there, Phelps?" she asked, her voice firm, though there was a trace of unease beneath the surface. "You've confessed. The boy is found. The family secrets are exposed." Phelps turned back to her, his eyes cold, but there was a flicker of something else in them, something deep, something unresolved. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "You've seen what was buried in the past, but you haven't seen what was left behind." "Left behind," Miss Marple repeated, a sense of dread creeping into her chest. "The boy wasn't the only thing Millicent hid," Phelps said, stepping closer, his voice almost a whisper now. "She hid a part of herself, a part of the family's past that no one, not even the Colonel, knew about. And now it's all coming back. The boy might have been the key, but he wasn't the whole story." Miss Marple's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what he was saying. She had assumed, with the Colonel's confession and Phelps's own admission, that the case had reached its finality. But now something didn't sit right. She hadn't asked enough questions. She hadn't considered enough angles. There was still something lingering, something she had missed. Phelps's eyes flickered toward the door as though expecting someone else. "You've done your part," he said, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "But the truth is never as neat as it seems. The boy's return wasn't the end of the Warburton story. It was just the beginning." Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. It was brief but distinct. Then the door opened slightly and Cecily stepped into the room, her face as pale as it had been before. Her eyes were wide, her expression tense. "Cecily," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but with an edge of concern. "What is it?" Cecily's lips parted, but she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she held up a piece of paper, carefully folded and sealed. Her hands trembled as she passed it to Miss Marple. I found this in the drawer," Cecily said, her voice a whisper, almost as if afraid to speak the words aloud. "It was hidden under some old receipts. I didn't know what it was, but when I saw the name on the top, Miss Marple took the paper from her, her eyes scanning it quickly. The letterhead at the top read, "Hawthorne and Blythe, Solicitors." Her heart skipped a beat as she read further. It was a document from Millicent Warburton, written just days before her death. The contents were clear, far more than a simple will or inheritance declaration. It was a legal document, detailing an arrangement that had never been mentioned before. Millicent had made provisions for the child she had kept hidden, but there was more, much more. The letter detailed a financial settlement for the child, but not just for the boy. There was mention of a trust, a large sum of money, and a clause that made Miss Marple's heart tighten. It was a provision for someone to inherit Windward House itself, but not Cecily. The child had been intended as the primary heir, yes, but only in the case of Cecily's death or something far darker. The document contained a clause that would trigger the inheritance should Cecily ever be unfit to carry out her duties as head of the household. Miss Marple looked up from the paper, meeting Cecily's eyes with a dawning realization. "The trust," Miss Marple said slowly, as if testing the words. It wasn't just about the boy inheriting. It was about control, about keeping the Warburton legacy in the hands of someone who could protect it. Someone who could... She trailed off, her eyes widening as the full meaning hit her. Someone who would never allow the truth to be exposed. Cecily swallowed hard. "What does that mean? Who else is involved?" "The answer is right, in front of us," Miss Marple murmured, her mind working quickly to connect the dots. Someone has been watching from the sidelines, someone who believes they are the rightful heir to everything, not just the house, not just the legacy, but the power that comes with it. Her heart pounded as she turned to Phelps, her voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "You knew, didn't you? You knew all along that the true heir wasn't just the child Millicent hid. You knew who was going to come for the inheritance." Phelps didn't flinch, but his eyes flickered with something darker, something Miss Marple had missed earlier. "You think you've got it all figured out, Miss Marple," he said coldly. "But you're not the only one who's been playing this game." A rush of realization hit her like a strike to the chest. It wasn't just about Millicent's secrets. It wasn't just about the boy or the inheritance. It was about who had been hiding behind the mask of civility, waiting for the moment to claim what they believed was theirs. "The true heir wasn't a child," Miss Marple said, her voice suddenly clear, her tone like ice. "It was Phelps," Cecily recoiled. "What do you mean?" "He's been... not a servant," Miss Marple interrupted, her mind now fully awakened to the final truth. Phelps was Millicent's brother, yes, but he was also the true heir to Windward House, the true heir to everything. Millicent made sure of it before she died. Phelps's expression darkened, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a cold certainty. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. It was never about the inheritance. It was always about control. And now that everything is falling apart, there's only one thing left to do." Miss Marple's mind raced as she saw the danger closing in. She was not done. There was still one final move to make before the truth could be fully realized. But, as Phelps took a step toward the door, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips, she knew it was time for one last confrontation. "You won't get away with this," she said calmly. Phelps paused, his back to her. "I already have." But, as he stepped into the hallway, Miss Marple knew something he didn't. She was one step ahead, as always, and the game was about to come to an end.